doing?
Doing good. Let me turn on my video there. I'm going to put on my headphones, I think, too.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me all right?
Awesome. Yeah, I can. How are you doing?
Perfect. Yeah, we'll do the video as long as it still seems to be pretty good. Looks to be pretty good on this end. I'm gonna close one other window just to make sure Skype doesn't yell at me part of the way through because it hates me sometimes. And let's see, let me close that one too just in case. I'm doing good. Yourself?
Doing well. Actually, just finished teaching my summer course, so I got a couple weeks of a breather, so that'll be nice.
Oh, nice. What were you teaching this summer?
Oh, it was just an intro to fitness and health and wellness class. So nothing too exciting. It was mainly freshmen and sophomores just trying to get into basic health and wellness. Just big overview on nutrition and fitness.
Oh, okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for doing this. And then obviously we have you on Iron Radio coming up this Saturday too. So that's super cool. Unfortunately, Lonnie won't be on Saturday. I think Phil might be. He might have something else going on at that time. But my thought was to do them as, even though they're on two separate shows, I'm on both of them, so you have to talk to me the whole time.
All right.
Do them as like a two-part thing that are still standalone episodes. So on Iron Radio on Saturday, we'll go into a little bit more of your origin story. And then I was thinking of talking more about maybe just like drug use in bodybuilding, primarily like testosterone. When should you, if you want to go that route, when should you decide? What does the research say? What are the pros? What are the cons? And then on this show, which will actually come out after that one, I thought it'd be interesting to talk a little bit more about some of the other aspects in the paper for peak week, especially like the biggest questions I'm sure you get all the time too is especially around like water retention, like what do I do for sodium loading and maybe some carbohydrate loading, something like that. So that if they want to listen to Iron Radio first and then this one, there'll be kind of a series. But if they listen each one independently, they'll have kind of still a self-contained item with it too.
Yeah, no, that works for me. That's absolutely fine. And I was going to ask you for Saturday, will we do the same method here like we're doing today?
Yep, exact same method, same thing. So, yeah. And then Saturday we probably won't, I don't know if we'll use video or not. But, yeah, exact same idea, same setup, same everything.
Okay, so you guys, it'll be through Skype as well?
Yep, it'll be through Skype, yeah.
All right. And then you'll reach out to me the same way you did here?
Yep.
Okay, sounds good. Perfect.
Yeah. Yeah, sounds good. And then I'll cut an intro to this one a little bit beforehand then too, so people have a little bit more info. So
perfect.
Yeah, if that sounds good, then we'll just do a short break and we're off and running.
All right.
Cool. Hey, what's going on? Welcome to the Flex Diet Podcast. I'm here today with Dr. Guillermo Escalante, who is a PhD, instructor, researcher, and also national level pro bodybuilder. So say hi.
Hello. I'm Guillermo Escalante. Nice to meet you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being on here.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mike, I actually wanted to say, I'm not a pro bodybuilder. I'm a national level bodybuilder.
National level. Okay.
And the NPC and my doctor is actually a doctor of science. It's a DSC, but I always see a PhD. They're always interchangeable there.
Yeah.
People often kind of throw them both around, but I always like to be clear just to not misrepresent myself.
Oh, no, thank you. I appreciate that. To me, anyone who gets to the national level, I look at some of the physiques, I can't tell much of a difference between, like you look at the elite of the elite, yeah, you can see a difference, but at some point you're like, to me, it just seems like seems very nitpicky, but that's me as more of an outsider.
No, you're absolutely right. You know what's funny? My very first bodybuilding show when I got into the sport, I went to the NPC California State Championships with a friend.
That's a big show.
He was trying to show me, kind of get me into the ropes. And when I went up there, I said, "Man, those pros are incredible." He said, Guillermo, there was only one pro there, and that was Lee Priest. That was a guest poser.
Oh yeah.
Every single other person there was an amateur. I said, how can you tell the difference?
Oh yeah.
But yeah, so it's not until you get into the circuit a little bit that you can actually really appreciate the differences.
Oh sure, yeah, and it's like all other athletics. Once you get to the ultra high end, I mean, you look at the 100-meter run or 200-meter, you're talking about just fine scale, differences between first through even 10th place. So yeah, it's like that with all athletics.
Yep, exactly.
Very cool. So today I thought it would be cool to talk about some stuff related to, people who are trying to get ready for a show, or even people listening who may not be competitive. I think there's a whole bunch of just general myths around, especially water, fluid, sodium, carbohydrates. And you came out with a really cool paper that summarized a lot of these different techniques, and we'll make sure to have a link to that in the show. But I think the big one that I'll start with is just water manipulation in general, right? I mean, even for competitive people, I've talked to a fair amount of competitive people about this. I remember having a conversation with a guy down in Texas years ago about this, and it's probably less now than I think it was maybe 10, 20 years ago. You can comment on that. But it appears that if you're a judge, it would be easy to say, oh, you're just holding a little bit of water, instead of, oh, maybe you weren't quite lean enough, or maybe you were holding more water. And there's this kind of perpetual notion that if you work with whoever the top guru is, that they have some uber secret special loading technique that's going to get you to be on point, like for every single show that you ever do. But then you see very, high-level people who are professionals. Some shows they look good, other shows, yeah, maybe not quite, not quite as good either. So, what are your thoughts about, even at the high level, and we'll kind of go backwards from there, recommendations for, let's say it's the final week before a show, what should you do with water and sodium, and how much do some of these sort of special techniques really buy you, or should you just do kind of, you look pretty good Wednesday, the show's Saturday, maybe we don't change a whole lot type of approach, which isn't very sexy.
Yeah, no, it's very true. I think often what we see in bodybuilding is we see this kind of myth that peak week is kind of where you put all your eggs in that basket, but really, right. I say put your eggs in the basket of, let's see what we did the prior 16, 18, 20 weeks of prep. And you highlighted something that's very important, which I think sometimes judges provide feedback and they'll say, oh, you're holding a little water, but it's usually not water. It's
right.
Usually, you're holding just excess body fat. And, and really, if you try to dehydrate that, now you just have dehydrated excess body fat.
Yeah.
But it's at the end of the day, you still have too much body fat. And I think that's often misconstrued. And I would say that's probably the situation in most competitors when they're told they're holding water, they're really just holding, an extra 3, 5, 7 pounds of body fat. Of course, from the judge perspective, I can kind of understand that. It's can be kind of heartbreaking and somewhat cruel.
Definitely.
You've been busting your butt for 3, 4, 5 months, and you're going to tell them, it's like, yeah, you're still a little bit fat. For
right.
our standards. So it's a little gentler to say, it's like, yeah, you just have to deplete your water a little bit more. And maybe they make a recommendation to a coach who hopefully knows what they're doing,
right.
and they can maybe help prepare them a little bit better. But that being said, I think peak week does offer some potential benefits, particularly for the higher level caliber. You mentioned earlier, as you get into higher level competition, say, at the Olympics in the 100-meter dash, a 0.01 difference is the difference between first and second, or a 0.05 second difference is between first and fifth sometimes. And in bodybuilding, that's very similar as well, where as we go up into like at the Olympia level, the difference between first and 10th is often, minor differences, which could incorporate this. So do these have relevance in the lower level? I would say yes, but probably not as much. I think if you go to most regional shows, you could probably still benefit from some of these peak week protocols, but they're probably going to be less important just because the level of competition of who you're standing next to is a little bit different compared to, say, a national level pro qualifier or a pro show where the level of competition is really steep. So my rule of thumb typically is peak week can offer some potential benefits, but it is not a miracle as some. You're right. A lot of people say it's like, oh, you have to follow this protocol to hit it right on point. Really, peak week should be used to make minor fine-tuning adjustments to your physique, and sometimes, if done incorrectly, they may actually backfire. So you have to weigh the pros and the cons of that, because sometimes by trying to manipulate these little variables, particularly water and electrolytes, those are typically the ones that can backfire the most. You can actually come out looking worse than you did, say, on Tuesday or Wednesday before the show. That being said, if you actually practice it and you've done everything else right and you fine-tune things correctly, you can potentially put yourself in an advantage, assuming that you hit all of the markers at the right time and you time things appropriately, you practice things appropriately.
Do you think it's useful to do, we'll start at the high level. Do you think at a high level it is useful to do some type of, water addition, depletion, electrolytes, playing around with that kind of stuff? Or because you had mentioned kind of the risk versus reward, is it better to just kind of go, let's just go more middle of the road and try to not make a bunch of changes at the end?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of inter-individual variability with how the bodies are going to respond. So one of the things that we actually highlight in the paper is sometimes it may be better for an individual to just leave things alone and it's as somebody said before, it's just another day in the office. So whatever you've been doing for the last 3-4 months, just show up another day in the office and show up that way. And of course it's like you said, it's not as sexy, but it can potentially work well for a lot of individuals, particularly if they've done their homework and they're very well prepared. Because if you're lean enough, you're going to have striated glutes, whether you deplete water or not. And that you're going to have those at 6 a.m. and you're going to have those at 8 p.m. if you're lean enough. If you're not, maybe not. That being said, though, if you have the ability to maybe practice some of those. So one of the recommendations that we make in our paper is, try to be ready about 2 to 4 weeks out so that you're pretty much ready, stage ready. You just need to do some fine tuning. And then at that point in time, maybe try to do some trial runs before you go in so you can figure out how your body's going to respond. So ideally 3 to 4 weeks buys you enough time before the show. And you can do a sample peak week protocol, say 4 weeks out. Play a little bit with carb loading, with the water manipulation, electrolyte manipulation. See how those variables work, and you can fine tune that, and of course jot everything down. Just like it's like you're your own science project at that point in time. Pay attention to how you look. Get somebody who knows what your physiques look like, knows what judging is about, to give you some of those tips onto whether you're looking, full or dry or looking flat, whatever the case may be. Also make sure that you're again, just being meticulous into how you're doing all of these things, writing down how much water did you take, what are you eating prior, what's your stress level like, because often stress and that can often impact how you respond. So if you're relaxed 4 weeks out, but then you're super stressed the day of the show, that may actually impact how you respond. So all of those variables are going to be very important. So of course, the more you can control and the more you can recreate that same pattern, the more successful you're going to be.
So do you think that it's possible to sort of, I don't like the word trick, but in essence, you're trying to trick the body a little bit into expelling more fluid than what it normally would? And so I'm assuming you would agree that that is possible. And then any sort of rules of thumb of kind of where people would start with that, just if we start simply with just in terms of electrolytes and with just water for now.
Yeah, and I will say sometimes because of the way that the body fluids work, they often kind of go hand in hand with the carbohydrate.
Right.
So if we look at the carb loading, there's a factor in there, and actually there was a study that we cited in there. It was done in the 1970s, actually, but they actually looked at dehydration in humans, and they actually put these people on. It was a pretty high intense protocol, and they actually dehydrated the snot out of them over the course of about 5.5 hours, and they actually looked at intracellular, extracellular water loss, and they looked at glycogen depletion. And what you typically see is initially. The body's going to try to maintain homeostasis. So we're going to typically try to maintain that ratio of intracellular to extracellular water ratio. But what happens is in the initial stages of dehydration, when you're actually carb deplete, or when you're losing the glycogen primarily of the muscle, the ratio is actually not very favorable toward the extracellular water. So in other words, you lose a lot of intracellular water because it comes with the glycogen. And then as you get more dehydrated, the ratio becomes closer to 1-to-1. So you can see that as you start dehydrating yourself with the carbs in there, if you actually are getting rid of the glycogen at the same time, you're kind of losing a lot of that water that you want in the muscle, and as you start getting more and more dehydrated, that ratio of extracellular to intracellular water loss becomes closer to 1-to-1, which means as a bodybuilder, of course, we want to maximize extracellular water, and we want to maximize intracellular water, and minimize extracellular water. That's kind of the goal, to get that full and dry look that we're after. But looking at physiology, if you start depleting the carbohydrates in there early on, you're going to be losing a lot of that intracellular water very early on. So really, it's important to make sure that you have enough, you keep your glycogen levels full, so that way you can put yourself in a better position to potentially minimize the loss of intracellular water within the muscle cell itself. But that being said, you mentioned another component there, and that's that time lag, and your body will lose that body water. Again, it actually loses it preferentially in that 1-to-1 ratio, unless you have that carbohydrate in there. So to actually say that you can lose more intracellular water or extracellular water than intracellular water, you can do it in a very small time lag, and you have to really kind of time things right, because your body is going to always try to kind of create that homeostasis anyway. As you know, with dehydration, that's going to impact your cardiovascular system, blood pressure, etc. So when your body recognizes, as you start getting dehydrated, blood pressure starts to drop, your body's going to try to regulate that blood pressure, that plasma osmolarity, and it's going to create a mechanism with release of hormones, the ROS system, the vasopressin, aldosterone system, to try to basically say, hey, we have to recreate this so that we can actually get our blood pressure back up and get it back up to normal. So, but that mechanism is kind of like a thermostat in the air conditioner. So if you set your thermostat at 76 degrees, there's going to be periods where it's going to go a little bit over and a little bit under that, and there's a little bit of lag time before it kind of gets to 76. And your body's kind of the same way. There's a little bit of lag period where your body the hormones are being released and your body's trying to kind of create this homeostasis. And it's in that little lag period that you really have to find that window of opportunity to kind of time things correctly. Because if you go too long or not long enough, then you miss the window, and then that's when you can potentially backfire on what happens and how you look on stage.
Yeah, because as you pointed out, you're really trying to create a very extremely temporary artificial state, right? Because it's not like necessarily a powerlifter or MMA fighter or something where you just have to literally make weight, and then we have a period of time to try to get fluid and volume and food and carbohydrates, glycogen, everything back. You're literally trying to create as much water inside, but not that much outside. So like you said, you can't just completely dehydrate the piss out of someone and be like, oh, you're good to go. It's like, no, that doesn't look very good. You want that internal water, but the external water outside the cell, you're actually trying to get low, and you're playing this game with, like you said, the hormones, and I think of like graphs with like a lag period, right? It's like you did the stimulus, and then you've got, we got like an hour before this system catches up and kind of overshoots, and then everything kind of goes to hell and you kind of look like shit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that can definitely happen. And even personally, I mean, I've been competing for over 20 years, and sometimes I'll come up with a bright idea that seems bright to begin with, and then after the fact I realize that probably wasn't so bright after all. And I've always been, I don't mind experimenting on myself and try different strategies. But just recently I did the 2020 USA Championships, and I haven't been a lightweight in years and years. I mean, probably over 20 years. But I had this idea that if I can dehydrate myself, because I had too much muscle mass to be able to get down to the lightweight class. So the only way I could get there was to severely dehydrate myself to make that weight class. And literally I lost about 14 pounds in the last, 24 hours before weigh-in. And I was probably still carrying a little bit of excess body fat. I needed to kind of be another 3 to 5 pounds leaner. So I was still lean, but not lean for my standard for a national level competition at the USA's. Anyway, long story short is I dehydrated so much and I pulled so much out of the system, both intracellular and extracellular water, that despite of how much I ate, and I ate quantities and quantities of food to really try to fill out, drank fluids. My body it couldn't respond in time. And I had that 24-hour period. So I weighed in, I think, on Friday at about maybe 2, 3 in the afternoon. And I had to step on stage on Saturday at about 9, 10 in the morning. And I literally ate all the way through and was drinking fluids. And my body, it was flat. And I didn't look my best. I placed 7th, so it wasn't terrible. But I didn't look my best. I've looked a lot better before. So it was one of those where, okay, getting down to that class is just not feasible to lose that kind of water weight over time, overnight. It was kind of like a boxing strategy that I did where I really, dropped a lot of that weight. And yeah, I made the weight, but the look was, like you said, not my best look.
Do you think, how much of that, you mentioned stress, and I think that's like a huge thing, right? Because it potentially explains why, 4 weeks out, okay, I did the protocol, I got all my notes, everything is, right to the T, and then I go to do this thing before the show, and it's a disaster, and nothing seems to work, right? But, a lot of people are very nervous before a show for, various different reasons. Like, how much do you think stress can kind of change with that whole process too? And especially the stress from dehydration and getting down to such a low weight, that's a massive stressor just in and of itself.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think it plays a huge role in your ability to look your best, for sure. And actually, we reported a couple of instances we have a couple of references where, when you have those high stress hormones in place, your body can actually, retain significant amounts of body water, the neighborhood of, 2-4 kilos of excess water weight from just that stressful situation. And of course, we have to consider all the other variables before you even got there. So, you've also been dieting for 16, 20 weeks.
Yep.
You've been training 5-6 days a week, 2-3 hours a day. You're stressed about looking good. You're stressed about making weight. So it's more than just one stress variable, like you said. So you have all of this kind of coming together. And it definitely makes an impact into how your body can respond to any variables that you manipulate.
Yeah, because I think that's one thing people forget about is that stress is very much accumulative and also acute, right? So like you said, you've got all the stress, you're in a depleted state, your calories are low, you're trying to keep your training volume up. In your case, you may have to travel somewhere for the show, or people may have to get on a plane, and you have all the stress of that and making sure the plane shows up and you get there on time, and where's the freaking hotel, and where's my food, and like all those things added on top where your stress is probably ridiculously high to begin with, and now you have to deal with all those other things.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's why I think, and again, I'm one of those people where I have a lot of protocols that have worked well, but I'm one of those people where I don't mind. Sometimes I'm a gambler, and I say, hey, you know what? Let's just do something completely outside the box, and let's see what happens. And and you win some and you lose some, because I have the protocol that we actually wrote is actually very much what I think is a safer road to get there, more consistent. It's a little more predictable, and it still leaves some room for, it's not a cookie cutter by any means. There's still a lot of inter-individual variability there, but it kind of gives you some very general guidelines to kind of give you a fairly broad lane to kind of stay in. And sometimes I've gone too far out of this lane and too far out of that lane. And sometimes it's been a disaster, and sometimes it's actually been like, wow, like I really hit that mark. And I think probably the two times that I've looked my best on stage, when I hit my mark right, I would say one of those times was probably one of those, a crapshoot where I just kind of tried random things, and then it actually happened to work. But I've had more disasters than successes, kind of like when you go to Vegas, right?
Yeah.
And then I've had more consistent results by doing kind of this, and I've actually shown up very good to that point. I would say arguably in similar condition to that one, in a much more predictable way. It's just sometimes we want to try to overcompensate and beat that. But I now, in all my years competing and working with clients as well, that more consistent protocol is definitely much more repeatable, and I think that's kind of what we're after with as a competitor.
How much of that do you think comes down to just client personality? Because one thing I do, and I only worked with a couple higher level competitors. Most of them, it's in their first show, or they haven't done a show for a while, or they're not at the national level. I always ask them, like, hey, we could be risk reward, right? We could try these things. You may look a little bit better, but the downside is if we kind of miss, you may look quite a bit worse. Or do you like this to kind of slow and steady, and we're just not going to make a lot of changes and just kind of go into it? So I guess more recently, in the last few years, I've been asking more competitors kind of what they prefer. And some of this is maybe out of my own ego, self-preservation, where I don't want to feel like I'm rolling the dice with all the work that they've put in, when their personality is very much kind of, no, I just want to do something that's, more slow and steady. They're more risk averse versus someone else who's like, I'm okay going for it. And then you explain, well, here's what may happen if you don't. How much of that do you think is kind of even based on their personality of what they may even try to do?
No, I think that's actually a really good point. And actually, I appreciate that that's your approach, because you're right. It's ultimately, it should be their decision.
Right.
And your coach is to kind of, help guide them into what they want. And you can give a recommendation, of course, but your recommendation is very true. It's like, hey, look, at the end of the day, I mean, as any scientist will tell you, and you and I are them, it's like, the more variables you throw up in the air, the more chances you're going to have some disaster.
It's not going to work.
Yeah, because you can't control those many things. So, so you throw up the carb depleting, carb loading variable. You throw up the water depleting, water loading variable. You throw up the sodium depleting, sodium loading variable. Now you have 3 variables already. And what other variables can you potentially manipulate? Some coaches may add a diuretic on top of that. They may add another supplement on top of that. They may add another drug on top of that. So before you know it, you have like 6 or 7 balls up in the air. And man, to make sure that you don't drop one of them, or that they all kind of stay where they should be, is very, very difficult. So yeah, I think your approach is really good. Asking them and give recommendations, give experiences, and help them make an educated approach. And I think that there are some people that maybe want to try some of these crazy variables. And then again, the other thing we have to think about is safety. That's another big thing that
definitely
we want to consider is what's going to be safer for you. And and I think if we explain that component to them, that could be another very important variable to consider.
Yeah. You mentioned some of the guidelines in the paper, so we'll obviously link to the paper, but what would some of the big sort of guidelines for people who may not pull the paper and read, which, if I remember right, it was available open access to, so anyone can get access to it, but what would be some of the kind of overall guidelines?
Yeah, so So we have the one first. What we looked at first in the paper was, what do bodybuilders do? Because with any of this, there's no evidence really in bodybuilding because
very little.
There are not many bodybuilders, and most of what we have is observational studies. Because one thing that I say with our tribe of bodybuilders is, how many competitors do you know that are going to be 12 weeks, 16 weeks out from a show and are going to raise their hand and volunteer to be part of a randomized control trial study where you're doing one intervention with this group and another intervention with another group, at which point you have to let go of all the control and let the scientists dictate that. That scenario, I think, is really a fallacy where you're going to actually have high-level bodybuilders that are actually going to go through that protocol, because by nature, we're going to want full control and full reign of our training, our sleeping, our eating, our drugs, if that's something that you're into. So there's a lot of variables that you're going to want to take hold of, and you're not going to let somebody else drive that car.
Right.
You might let your coach, but you're going to trust that coach, and that coach is not going to necessarily be in line with what that scientist is particularly studying.
Right.
The other thing I think of is when we're doing as a scientist, we're looking at very specific variables, which means that when we're doing an intervention, we're only going to manipulate one variable at a time because we have to. If we're actually trying to answer a question, we can't possibly study all the variables and see what works best, because then you don't know what worked. You have to kind of take one at a time to do it. So that makes it a very difficult situation to study a bodybuilder. So what we're left with is observational studies on the field, asking what you're doing, how they're doing it, why they're doing it, and trying to figure that component out. And then maybe from those observations on the field, it's like, look at what maybe some of the top tier competitors are doing. What are the winners doing, and what do they have in common, and see if you can kind of put some common threads together to be able to study that. Outside of that, I think there are other valuable studies we can do, but it's not going to necessarily be with the high level competitive bodybuilders that we may be used to looking at. So that being said, within that construct of our paper, we looked at what studies have been done, what's the literature say, and what's most popular, what are and what's the reason for potentially doing them, and then based on that, what are our recommendations based on what we know, based on physiology, based on even in some cases even animal models, because there's just no data to look at. So that being said, we start with carbohydrates first because that is the most prominent. There's probably the most research on that as well. And there's been several studies now that actually show some good promise that carb depletion and carb loading do work. I published a case study with Brad Schoenfeld and a couple of other good scientists just last year. And we actually looked at his carb depletion, carb loading protocol, and we actually looked at muscle thickness, and he was actually able to, through the process alone of carb depletion and carb loading, through that super compensation effect, he was actually able to increase the size of his arms and his legs a little bit, which was pretty telling.
Yeah.
There was also another study done with by Demorais et al. This was actually on bodybuilders who actually went through they were getting ready to compete. So this was actually kind of cool because it was closer to our tribe. And they actually looked at their one group did carb loading, carb depletion, carb loading. The other group didn't do anything. And they actually they had judges evaluate their physiques. They were blinded, so they didn't know who did the carb loading and who didn't. And those that were able to carb load actually ended up looking a little bit better. Of course, some of the complaints that they had was a lot of GI discomfort. So when we see some of that, we see how that can potentially be a factor of consideration, because that may make you feel bloated. You might have gas. You may be uncomfortable. So that's not always a great feeling. But one hypothesis that we said is, one thing that we often see with bodybuilders is they typically deplete sodium at the same time that they are carb loading. But we need those sodium-dependent glucose transporters to be able to maximize absorption of those carbohydrates. And again, none of this was reported, but a hypothesis is if you're carb loading and you're sodium depleting at the same time, you're probably not doing yourself a favor in that GI discomfort. Another thing you want to consider is how much fiber were they taking in. If you have too much fiber, that may actually impact your ability to, it might increase your GI discomfort when you're doing some of the carb loading. Protein intake is another variable that goes hand in hand with that. So typically, just to get the extra calories, you don't want to necessarily overeat. So in order to kind of keep your calories in check, you probably want to keep the protein on the relatively lower side, your fats on the relatively lower side. So that way you're not necessarily overeating so many calories, but you can still get the carb in there during the carb loading phase. And then the other consideration is, how do you want to do the carb loading? So you can front load it, you can back load it, or you can kind of in between load it. So front loading would mean, let's just carb up early. So the show's on Saturday, let's carb up maybe on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and kind of hold through the end of the week. Or you can backload it, where you maybe deplete on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then you carb up on Thursday, Friday to compete on Saturday. That's the backloading. And then the one that we actually recommended is kind of a middle hybrid, where you actually deplete maybe on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and then you actually load on Wednesday, Thursday. And then on Friday, you kind of back off the gas a little bit, and you're not loading anymore. Hopefully, you've had 48 hours to be able to fill those glycogen stores. And of course, that goes hand in hand with the next area, which is the water manipulation. And by the way, we do give some recommendations on how much carbs do we take in the carb depletion and the carb loading. Again, there's some individual variability there, but it really ranges. Our recommendations are as low as 4 grams per kilogram of body weight, all the way up to 12 grams per kilogram of body weight. So, because it just depends on how you respond. Personally, I need a lot of carbs to fill out. If I'm eating 300, 400 grams of carbs, that doesn't touch me. That doesn't fill me up. For me, I need at least 800, maybe 1,000 grams for 2 solid days before I actually see full benefit of the super compensation effect. So there's going to be some, and I've had some clients that are the other way. It's like, 4 grams per kilogram is like, that's plenty. And they might not be able to handle that much for entire 2 days. They might only need it for a day, or, maybe a few meals. So it just kind of depends on what that individual looks like. And some people may need longer, right? They might need a third day of carb loading at really high levels. So that's where kind of the variables can kind of change. So we give some very broad recommendations into where they are. So the next thing is the water, and again, one of the ways we can do with the water is just don't do anything at all, right? We can actually say, it's like, hey, that might actually be the best thing. It's one less variable you have to manipulate. Just keep your normal water intake. If anything, maybe, okay, so drink your water on Friday night, maybe on Saturday morning, just drink enough to kind of have a meal in, but not enough to make you bloated or make you feel, and then show up on stage, but you're really not depleting your water. Or maybe you just cut it off a little. You maybe taper your water down a little bit on Friday night, but you're still drinking plenty of fluid throughout the day. Maybe the last, at 5, 6 o'clock the night before, 24 hours before you step on stage, you go ahead and start kind of tapering the water a little bit, but you're still getting some fluid in you. So those are some potential strategies that are, again, not sexy, but it's one less variable that you have to worry about. One strategy that we've used and that there's actually a little bit of research on in fighters is this concept of water loading and then water depleting. So this concept would be to the point where you drink, say, 100 milliliters per kilogram of body weight for about a 3-day period, and then you quickly drop the water intake down to 15 milliliters per kilogram of body weight for a 24-hour period. And then there's a little bit of research in there where you kind of see that temporal lag in some of the hormones. And in the study that they looked at, they actually had the individuals, they had 2 groups, and these weren't bodybuilders, these were fighters, but they had one group do that water loading strategy at those dosages. The other group just stayed consistent at 40 milliliters per kilogram of body weight all the way through. They both did a water depletion at 15 mLs per kg for 1 day. And what happened was the group that did the loading, they actually lost. I can't remember the exact number, but they lost more body weight, more body water over that course of time. Of course, we can't tell if that was intracellular or extracellular water. So for a bodybuilder, that's really important. But the way that we hypothesize in our group is I talked earlier about the importance of glycogen. So for water loading, while you are carb loading, and that would be the case in our protocol. So if you're depleting on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and that's just regular water intake, then on Tuesday you begin the water loading, but then Wednesday, Thursday, you're also water loading, but now you have all these carbs in there. And theoretically, we actually recommend a slight increase in sodium because you have so much water, you're going to need to increase the sodium. So you don't want that sodium diluted in your system. And then with the carbohydrate in there, now we can hopefully maximize that intracellular water intake, that intracellular water in the cell. So now we kind of have that best case scenario. Then on Friday, you now cut the water down. So you don't cut it out, you just cut it down to 15 mLs per kg, at which point you can hopefully continue to lose some of that body water. And hopefully, because you stop training at that point in time, because that's another variable that we kind of looked at. Don't train too much, don't pose too much. Those glycogen stores are full now because you've super compensated them for that 24-hour period or 48-hour period. You've had all that water in there. You've had a little sodium in there to be able to do that. And then at that point in time, you can now just release the water, hopefully, because you're not doing any workouts, you're keeping your glycogen. You can hopefully preferentially lose more of that extracellular water rather than the intracellular water. And that would be on that Friday. On Friday, you go down now you drop the carbohydrate intake similar to your carb depletion days. So that would be what you did like on Monday, Tuesday. You increase protein intake to, again, potentially promote diureses. And you can actually do fat loading is the other component that we do. So early in the week when you're carb depleting, we actually start fat loading. And then on Friday, because you're also not carb loading anymore, you can potentially do fat loading as well. And the reasoning for the fat loading is the muscle itself has that we have some intramyocellular triglycerides in the muscle itself. And theoretically, and we actually cite a couple of papers on this, you can actually somewhat increase the supercompensation of those intramyocellular triglycerides to the point where you might be able to actually now have a little bit of that fullness in the muscle, not only from the glycogen, but now also from those IMTs rather. And then you have that basic full muscle. So hopefully using that strategy, you now maximize the intracellular water, you've maximized the glycogen, you've maximized the intramyocellular triglycerides to get that full muscle.
And when do you do much with sodium then leading up to the show then with those approaches then? Or would you taper it down, I would assume? Or do you do more of like a hard cut off and still have some water, or any preference in that area?
Yeah, the sodium, we basically have whatever your baseline is. So you have a baseline intake. So during your water loading and carbohydrate loading phases, you're actually going to increase sodium a little bit for those 2 days. So you're doing somewhat of a sodium loading on, say, Wednesday, Thursday. And I wouldn't necessarily call it a loading. It's just a slight increase in your intake. So maybe like a 30% increase from your normal sodium intake. And again, none of these are hard numbers because there's been no research on this stuff. So these are numbers that we say, do we really want to double it? So we give a general guideline, but again, it's just based on that's really based more on experience because there's no solid data to actually show that. And then at the end, because we actually cut down the sodium a little bit, not necessarily cut it down. We just go back to baseline on that Friday before. So you don't really deplete it. You just go to baseline. So you go from baseline to say 30-40% above baseline for a couple of days, and then back to baseline.
Got it. For the carbohydrate depletion and then reloading, how important do you think the depletion part of it is, right? I mean, this goes all the way back to some of the early Swedish studies looking at not bodybuilders, but performance athletes. And the classic thing, I don't know, it's never really made a lot of sense to me because you are literally brutalizing someone. Like, if for people who are listening, right, to do a real actual carbohydrate depletion, it's a little bit different in bodybuilders because they're pretty much friggin' depleted already. But if we take an athlete who has normal glycogen stores and we try to deplete them, that's a lot of friggin' muscular work to, on a biopsy, actually, to get them to show up with low levels, and then you then replete them, and then you have your event. I think that, to me, doesn't make a whole lot of sense because performance is the outcome, and you've got this super high period of stress beforehand. But do you think the depletion part is needed? And then how would that necessarily apply to physique athletes who are probably walking into it pretty friggin' depleted by that point already?
Yeah, I think a lot of that, it does really depend on what that athlete looks like, what their diet looks like, because some athletes may be coming into that peak week and, they're only consuming, 75 grams of carbs a day, 100 grams of carbs a day. So, at that point, it's like they're probably already kind of depleted, right? So we have to kind of go down. So we really just say, you kind of minimize it. You don't necessarily need to go to 0 grams of carbs. And we kind of start a general guideline of about half a gram per kilogram of body weight for kind of as a general starting point. But obviously, if you are normally taking, say, 75 grams a day, you might need to drop that a little bit. So you might need to just cut that in half for a few days. And again, because performance is not really the issue, we just want to kind of create hope. Your body's probably adapted to that state. So we want to just kind of try to accentuate the effect of the carbohydrate loading. And that's what we're trying to do in the super compensation component afterwards. So I don't think we necessarily need to drop it to 0, but I think you have a little bit more. And because what you said, performance is not really the issue with physique athletes. We just care about looking good, right? So it doesn't matter, how much how fast we run or how long it takes us to do an event. We just want to look better. So in that respect, I think we have a little bit more wiggle room. Oh, and one thing I did forget to mention in the carb loading phase, one of the other important components is your potassium intake. You want to make sure you're also consuming enough potassium at that point in time. So you don't necessarily need to supplement with potassium, but just make sure you're having some foods, potassium-rich foods within your diet, so that you can help, because that's the intracellular cation. So we want to make sure that we intake that. We don't want to take that out of the equation in the carb loading phase.
Yeah, and I think the high-end amount of carbohydrates is probably shocking to people, right? Because I remember the first time, I don't even remember who the competitor was. I was talking to his coach probably 8 years ago, and he was telling me that he was, what was he competing, around 210 pounds, I think, and he was at 1,000 grams of carbohydrates for 2 days before the show. And I was like, what? What are you talking about? That seems crazy, and then you realize that it was kind of relatively common. And then I have also wondered how many people are scared of carbohydrates and may have not looked as good because maybe they never tested going higher than 400 grams, And again, I think there's a very wide variability there, but I think it's kind of shocking probably for people listening to go 1,000 grams of carbohydrates. Like, if you look at how much that is in actual food, right, you're looking at, that's grams of carbohydrates. This is not calories, right?
Yes.
That's 1,000 grams of carbohydrates.
Yeah, it's 4,000 calories.
Exactly.
Just carbohydrates. Yeah, and it's very challenging. And actually, I was one of those people, as you stated, when I first started bodybuilding, my first, I want to say 3-4 years, I coached myself. And, even though I had a background in strength and conditioning and in nutrition, but I had never really coached bodybuilding. I had been doing it myself. But I remember my first coach actually, during peak week, he actually carb loaded me, and the amount of carbs he gave me, I mean, I was so scared to eat that much carbs. I mean, I said, you're going to give me like how many? I mean, and it was gigantic quantities. I mean, all day. And unbelievably, like I looked so much better. I mean, I could not believe, the look that I got, because before a high carb day might be 250 grams. And then,
yeah.
His high carb day was, 3 times that.
Yeah.
And I mean, it was unbelievable. That being said, to be able to consume that much carbohydrate is extremely challenging.
Yeah.
I mean, you can only eat so much rice, and you can only eat so much yams and potato. So I think sometimes some of these supplements, for example, like Carbolin, can be something that's potentially effective that you can actually utilize, or any one of those carbohydrate powder.
I've used Vitargo a fair amount.
Yep, exactly. So and that can be an easy way to they're easily digestible, and you can actually get an easy 100 grams of carbs in a sitting, and it doesn't fill you up like, let's say, having 2.5 cups of white rice.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. And how do you think that, I guess you say, drugs sort of enter the picture? Because the reason I hesitate is some people use them, some people won't. Sometimes it's tested for, sometimes it's not. And we're all probably familiar with, I mean, the first time I ever realized that this was an issue was, God, how many years ago was it, the day they carried like Paul Dillette off the stage, just like twitching, and I thought he was dead, and how many times you see professionals just get it really wrong, and there's really high side effects like death like associated with that. Like, how do you kind of approach that, assuming we're not talking about legal or ethical issues per se, just based on physiology and what we know of research?
Yeah, unfortunately, we actually report several case studies that are in the medical literature of bodybuilders where they were they had to report to the emergency room, and these particular individuals didn't have the worst side effect, which is death, because that's what can happen. And we've seen it happen. I'm sure you've seen it happen. I certainly have, and it's so unnecessary. But it is prevalent. I think it's very common in high level bodybuilding circles, and sometimes even in the regional shows. Sometimes I think in female competitors it's extremely prevalent, like the bikini competitors. And we're not and for this type of drug, usually these drugs that are killing the individuals, it's not the anabolic androgenic steroids.
Yeah.
It's not any of those things. The two main killers are typically going to be a diuretic, a prescription grade diuretic, and maybe insulin. Those are the two worst that are going to be in there, and it's because they're misused. They're often misunderstood. Often they don't understand, how they work, or you sometimes get an individual who's unfamiliar. So I just posted something on this on my Instagram the other day.
Nice.
On aldactone.
Yeah.
And there was an individual that actually posted. He said, I actually had a friend of mine almost die because they actually prescribed the aldactone, which is a potassium sparing diuretic, and they had him in addition to, so it depletes sodium, but it actually spares potassium. They had him take more potassium on top of that, creating this hyperkalemia effect.
Oh no!
And of course they ended up in the hospital.
Yeah.
And with some severe conditions. So this is where they don't understand some of these. And of course there's a ton of different diuretics that are out there, but aldactone is very commonly prescribed. Lasix is another one, which is a much stronger loop diuretic, which depletes your sodium and your potassium. And and sometimes you even hear people using the injectable Lasix, which is
I heard that the first time I heard that, I was like, what? I was like, holy shit.
IV Lasix. Yeah, it's like what are you doing?
Yeah.
And why? Because it's totally unnecessary.
Yeah.
But they are practices. For many years, for about 7 years, I actually did athletic training services for a lot of the local bodybuilding community, and those were the biggest things that I saw was all big signs of dehydration, and actually the reason that they hired me initially was because there was an event sometime in 2011, 2012, I think 2011, but there was a master's level competitor who had abused a lot of these drugs. He actually died
Oh.
He physically died beforehand, and then they had no emergency medical responder immediately there. So by the time the ambulance arrived, it was already too late. So that was actually you need to have somebody there. And typically what I treated was, luckily I had no deaths, but I did hear of a competitor that was getting ready for a show. This happened in the hotel room before they even came to check in. So it came out in the paper. So not even the promoters knew about it, but there was a female competitor who was going to compete at this event, a big national event. And before she was even able to show up to register, she was having complications in the hotel room. And sure enough, within 24 hours, she had actually died. 30-some years old, had 2 kids. I mean, it's tragedy. Tragedy. So you hear these things, and I have taken competitors off stage, from pros to amateurs to a ton of bikini girls.
That seems really crazy to me for bikini, and I'm not putting them down or the work they do or anything like that, but it just, to me, it seems like such an unneeded risk at that level, even for what you're trying to look like, as what is even held up as the thing you're trying to get to. That seems very odd to me, I guess.
Yeah, and that's what's frustrating. And, I kind of blame that is, they a lot of times they have their bodybuilder boyfriend who's 220 pounds, and I take aldactone, so you're going to take aldactone, and
oops, I gave you the same dose. Oops,
gave you the same dose. Yeah, exactly. So all of those same things, where it's like, it's like the blind leading the blind sometimes, or just irresponsible coaches that do that as well in extremely high dosages that are unnecessary for most situations.
Yeah. And you had mentioned insulin too, which I think also has, you can argue about the effectiveness of it. I've heard pros and cons from people that have used it, but I think I remember the story of it. Was it Sarkier? Is that how you say his name?
Milos Arcev, yeah.
Yeah. Maybe you were telling me this, or someone, where he was accosting the stewardess on the plane because he took the wrong dose of insulin, and so he was like trying to get all the orange juice he could find so that he wouldn't go into a coma.
Oh my, yeah, I don't know if that was, I don't think that was me, but I've heard that story before.
Yeah, I think everyone's heard the story.
Yeah, and no, and that is a real risk with the insulin, where people just, again, don't take the right dose. Instead of taking 10 international units, they take 100 international units. And that's the difference between potentially absorbing more carbohydrate and a diabetic coma and death. So those, you see a lot of these things. And again, insulin is one of those where in the off season, I think there's still a debate whether it's
right.
Whether excess insulin may actually potentially help or not. But pre-contest, in peak week, when competitors use it, it's typically as a result of let's try to maybe increase the amount of carbohydrates we can absorb. And again, especially if you're in a rush, so maybe you had to make weight and then you only have 24 hours to carb load. The hypothesis is by taking this insulin, you can actually super compensate faster. But again, I think it's often negligible, the amount of difference that it may make.
Yeah, and I always think of people who may be using drugs for whatever reason, and I've talked to Rick Collins a fair amount about this too, like most of the drug use in this area is not necessarily for people that are even competing, and so if you look at like the risk versus reward profile, we're not talking about, ethics or legality or any of that kind of stuff. Insulin and some of the diuretics for the average person, I would put like near the bottom in terms of even almost pure effectiveness on a day by day thing for what they're trying to achieve for a look. But I think they hear, oh, so and so pro did this or someone else did this, and that was the magical thing, and they don't know what the risk profile associated with that, especially acutely. That to me is just scary, that there's not more education around, here's some of the potential things it may help with, Oh, and these things also carry this kind of exponential risk associated with them acutely too.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. I think sometimes people just are misinformed and, and they hear somebody did that. But yeah, especially if, even if you use, androgenic anabolic steroids as your performance enhancement drug, and you're the average Joe, you're not competing,
right.
There is zero need for you to ever do a diuretic ever. And,
right.
and I would even argue, even if you are going to step on stage, I think there's really no need to have to use a diuretic if you're in shape. If you're really in condition, the need of the diuretic is completely unnecessary.
Yeah. Do you think, and this is speculation again, but the stories I've heard, which again, who knows how true they are, but it just seemed like most of the stories that I heard that it went really sideways was people not sure what they're doing, and someone trying to maybe get a bigger effect because something else went wrong during the week, right? So kind of like the use of insulin or, oh, you don't look lean enough, let's give you a diuretic. It just seems like it's I don't want to say a knee-jerk response, but it seems like they're trying to fix something else that didn't come in the way that it should, and a lot of times that can even be more disastrous.
Yeah, no, I think a knee-jerk response is right. That's kind of like the automatic go-to for a lot of coaches is if you're almost in shape, if you're like 4 weeks out, really.
Right.
So instead of telling the person you really just need 4 more weeks to diet, then they might say, okay, well, let's just take some aldactone, let's just take some thiazide instead. Which again, usually the result is still going to be that's when that person is going to show you. Then we're going to go full circle. That individual is going to go back to the judge after to get feedback, and the judge is going to tell him, "You're holding too much water," which then might tell him to think it's like, well, if coach gave me that aldactone, maybe next time if I was holding too much water, I need to take double or triple the amount to do it, which creates a bigger problem. And it wasn't water to begin with. The problem was they were 5 to 10 pounds too fat for a bodybuilder competitor, and that's really what they needed. They needed 4 or 5 more weeks of dieting, not to drop more water.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you so much for this discussion. I really appreciate it. When people are listening to this, we'll have one on Iron Radio also that they'll be able to go back and listen to. So, yeah, I really appreciate all your research and just sharing all your personal experience over the years, all the things you've tried. And it's also super cool to talk to you that you're all, updated on the research from, the physiology mechanisms, what's been done and what's been tried. Because I think there's sometimes it's getting a lot better, I think, than it used to be 10 plus years ago. I think there's less of a gap now between, what is kind of going on with physiology versus what are the experience. So it's nice to see that gap's kind of hopefully closing a little bit more than what it used to be.
No, thank you so much. I appreciate you having me. It's been a blast, and I look forward to another podcast in the future.
Yeah, and where can people find more about you? I know you share a bunch of stuff on your Instagram, but tell everyone where they can find out more about you.
Yeah, so my Instagram handle is @DrGFit. That's all one word, so @DrGFit. And I post a lot of educational stuff, not just related to bodybuilding. I do some general health stuff too, or nutritional supplements or protein, whatever, anything that's health and fitness related. And I do post some stuff, of course, related to bodybuilding as well. And you can also find me on, I'm at Cal State San Bernardino. I'm an associate professor there, and you can definitely find me on the website there, and you can email me through there, and I'll be happy to respond.
Awesome. Thank you so much for all your time. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Cool. Thank you. That sound all right?
All right, man. Yeah, I think it sounded good.
Okay.
It sounded really good.
Anything that you're all right with everything we said to leave it in? All good with that?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
I don't know if you want to redo the intro, I'm okay with that. I didn't want to put you on the spot. If you want to redo that part, I don't know what's better for you. If you're fine with it, I don't care.
I'll just cut another intro beforehand. So I usually try to do it relatively as best live as I can, but yeah. Oh, Jody wanted to say hi.
Hi, Jody. How are you? Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
But yeah, thank you so much for the discussion. I think that's That's good, because I think one thing that gets glossed over a lot, and when we're on Iron Radio, we'll talk probably more about anabolics and stuff too, is just the risk reward profile, because there's so little correct education on it that it just drives me insane when you see like bikini people doing diuretics. You're like, what the fuck are you doing?
Oh yeah. And it's like high dose. I mean, I don't know how many girls I've had, literally like fainting, from low blood pressure. And I mean, it's like, and that's typically the common thing. It's like, I see them, I see their eyes are wheezing, so I sit them down, I check their blood pressure. Sure enough, it's usually like down in the dumps, heart rate super high, so it's like 110 beats per minute, super faint. I'm like, okay, so what diuretics did you take? That's my next question. Yeah. What diuretics did you take?
You're like, how did you know?
Yeah. And then of course it's just a matter of rehydrating them and getting electrolytes in them. And then of course they're freaking out. It's like, well, but I'm going to look water. I'm like, well, looking water is better than dying. I said, so take the Pedialyte and drink it. Shut up.
Right. Yeah. You can do another show. Like, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. But yeah, you see a lot of this stuff. It's just so crazy, and it's frustrating. Frustrating that a lot of these coaches are out there, and and often some of these coaches are the ones that are the busiest coaches. Yeah. They have the most athletes, and so they're literally influencing the most people.
Yeah, a good friend of mine, she was sponsored by Muscle Tech at one point, and so she was a figure competitor, and she had done it for quite a while, but she had to show up and do guest posing and that kind of stuff. So she had to kind of stay, in pretty good shape most of the time. Had accumulated a bunch of injuries, a bunch of other stuff going on. And I asked her when I was working with her, I said, well, what was your coach like? You had a coach this whole time. Like, what at the end, like, what did he have you do? He's like, he just told me to take more Anavar. I'm like, what? That was his solution to you have like all these musculoskeletal injuries? You're calorically depleted. She's like, yeah, I realized at that point I needed to get out. I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah, isn't that crazy? Yeah, so unsustainable, and yeah, it's sad. It's really sad. Have you heard of Victor Black?
Victor Black? No.
Yeah, he's out of Thailand. You can find him on Instagram.
Okay.
So just it's Victor Black Mass, but he's an engineer by trade, but he's in his 50s. Meathead guy, but he's actually very well educated particularly in performance enhancement drugs. And he posts a lot of really good content. The guy reads stuff that's like out under the woods, even in articles in German. He'll put some stuff on that. And man, he knows his PEDs really well. So he goes against the grain with a lot of people. He's one of these guys. He's a fuck you guy. He doesn't care what people, he says that it is, and he'll call people out. And so he's really funny. But he can be a little rough around the edges, but I like him because he's just very honest, and he's got a good science mind, and like, hey guys, like, let's look at what the real evidence says. And, he keeps an open mind. He doesn't mind being challenged, but he says, show me the evidence and then we'll debate the evidence. But, I could care less what your opinion is. Let's see what the science says. But anyway, he puts a lot of good content with female athletes and male athletes. And his model is basically, a much safer, lower dosage base, so more sustainable, looking at health biomarkers. What health biomarkers do you want to look at? And that's kind of his motto. It's slow, consistent, rather than these aggressive, super physiological doses for long periods of time. But anyway, if you check him out, you'll probably enjoy some of his stuff because he's got a lot of good stuff on PEDs.
Oh, that's cool. Because you just think at some point, like, no matter how much shit you have on board, like, there's only so far your physiology is going to go in a certain period of time. You know what I mean? And at some point, you've gone to the point where you cross that, like, tipping point where, like we talked about, you're just getting more side effects. And even if that's your deal and you're a pro and whatever, you're not getting better. You're actually getting worse at some point.
Right.
So.
Right. Yeah. No, and that's one thing that I often say is sometimes your gift, a person's gift, genetic gift, is that they have the ability to either do two things. They have a tolerance for high drugs, and their body's not negatively effective, which makes them be able to make those gains. Or you have the other extreme where a little drug goes a very long way, so therefore they don't need to do so much to get the benefits. And then you got most of us that are kind of in the middle there, where it's like at some point, like you said, you're going to be, you're going to hit a point of diminishing returns really quick. And despite of how much more stuff you inject or you intake, you're not going to get better. So it's not going to happen.
Yeah. And last point too, and I'll let you go, is that if you look at like photos of most competitors at a national level when they started, I remember seeing a picture of Lee Priest when he was 18, and I was like, what? And there's an interview, and he's like, no, I didn't do any drugs until later. And I'm like, you looked like that at 18? Like, he's like, yeah, I started training early, trained at like 13 or something like that. But I'm like, that's only 5 years of training. It's like, holy shit, that's insane.
Yeah. And when you look at the best guys, that's often what you see is like, I mean, these people were, very gifted early on. So it's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool, man. Well, thank you so much, and we'll chat again on Saturday morning.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks for having me, man. It was
Thank
great.
you. Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.